Ladies and gentlemen, are you tweeting? Can we have a show of hands? How many people tweeting? What's the Twitter handle? What is the Twitter handle? Okay, eSummit 14. Please tweet or at least visit Twitter and see what's happening. If you want to tweet anything about the sessions that are in progress or the sessions that you have liked, you're really enjoying yourself at IIT Bombay, then please go to Twitter. The Twitter handle is hashtag eSummit14. Moving on, the next discussion that's lined up for us is an extremely interesting one, and the discussion is being partnered by a company called Code for India, as you can all see. It's on making a fortune at the bottom of the pyramid. And may I please invite the first speaker or our person who's going to be discussing with us on the stage, Mr. Vishnu Swaminathan, Country Director India at Ashoka. He joins Ashoka with more than 14 years of experience as entrepreneur and innovator. He started 2 IT-based companies in Singapore in the areas of financial transactions and animation technology. So can we have a huge round of applause for Mr. Vishnu Swaminathan. It's my privilege to invite the second speaker on stage. Srimati Sheila Patel is the founder director of the Society for Promotion of Area Resource Centers, an NGO that has been working since 1984 to support community organizations of the urban poor in their efforts to access secure housing and basic amenities and seek their right to the city. Sir, ma'am, the stage is all yours. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a difficult thing to follow up on a celebrity session, but I guess many of you are new into this room. We are going to talk about what is really happening at the bottom of the pyramid. It's not about any fancy things, but it's really getting onto the ground and understanding what's happening there. Now, before I really talk about bottom of the pyramid, I'm sure many of you know about bottom of the pyramid. Dr. Prahlad came out of the concept, and then it really spurred the movement or talking about what the bottom of the pyramid or the base of the pyramid was. There was both sides to it. One was it was really great that everybody started talking about BOP, but on the other hand, it also kind of, in some levels, oversimplified the BOP. Because, anybody who was earning less than $2 a day was called the base of the pyramid. So, I'll let Sheilaji talk a little later, but people who have been working in this field know that it's not just the bottom of the pyramid. So let me just set the context by actually reversing the whole thing and calling it pyramids of the bottom. Now, I'll just take a minute to let you know what I mean by pyramids of the bottom. Whenever you work in this sector or when you talk about these large economic groups of people who are close to, I think, now 4 billion people around the world or increasing every day, is that you cannot flavor them by one level. You will have to see them as multiple pyramids. So can you just go to the next slide? So I'll just want to show you this, is that when you talk about the economic pyramid, you literally draw a pyramid within the BOP and say there is multiple levels of people and multiple types of solutions are needed for the base of the pyramid. So in this case, I have just dissected the pyramid and I'm not going to talk about the top, I'm going to talk about the BOP as someone who's earning anything between $500 rupees a month as household income, all the way up to even 25,000. Now, it's a very interesting question. Why is somebody earning 25,000 rupees as household income called a base of the pyramid? Now, let me just tell you, there's only one definition, in my opinion, to talk about BOP. Anybody who cannot prove their income today in India is called a base of the pyramid customer. If you cannot prove your income, you're called a BOP. Now, who cannot prove the income? Incidentally, it happens that 94% of the people in urban India today cannot prove their income. 94%, by the way. So 94% of the people, if they cannot prove their income, they are simply called the base of the pyramid. Now, why is it so? Any guesses on how much percentage of Indians pay income tax? Sorry? Great. It's 3%, right? Now, for a country this large, 3% of the people pay income tax, which is okay. But what it really happens today is you go to any bank, ask for a loan. What do you get? First question. There you go. PAN card is not even accepted. PAN card just merely shows you're registered. You need a e-Saral form to show that, that you've really filed the tax and what it really means. So, and then, you have all these credit card evaluation methods, CIBIL rating and all that is going on, all for the 3% of the population, right? So then you're left with 97% of the people literally not getting access to formal markets or capital from the formal markets. So then you take off some people who don't need it, and then you're left with 92 to 93% of the people who really are called the base of the pyramid. So if you're really looking at the base of the pyramid, the fundamental thing I say is that you have to look at multiple types of solutions for the BOP. Be it products, be it services, you understand what it really takes. The left side talks about the price of product and service. You just can't say that this is for the higher income people, this is for the low income people. You really have to dissect it. Now, one biggest challenge in this country is on housing, right? Housing, again, whatever is available in the market today can be only bought by 6% of the population. So whatever is available, what about the 93 to 94% of the people? They can never buy a house. Now, obviously, you need kinds of solutions in the base of the pyramid. It can start with transitional housing. People who really move into the cities because the cities are swelling up, you need to provide transitional housing for them. And then you have a group of people who have lived in the cities for many years. But guess what? 80% of Indian slums are on illegal land or government land, right? So how do you provide solutions for them over a period of time to incrementally improve their houses? But there is a small group of people in the base of the pyramid who are the emerging middle class. People are waiting to become the middle class, and those people need a new housing available to them, but at a much substantially lower cost. We feel that cost should be less than 10 lakh rupees. So within 10 lakh rupees, if you can provide a housing, they can buy it on a mortgage, but somebody has to provide the mortgage. We'll talk about that. But what is interesting is that let's understand the whole dynamics of what's really happening at the base of the pyramid from Shilaji. Shilaji has been working for almost 2 decades on this area, more than that? 3 decades. So 3 decades in the area of housing in the city of Mumbai. She knows more Dharavi than anybody of us all put together collectively. So let's just understand from Shilaji about what is the dynamics of housing, but we'll also move away from housing and talk about the characteristics about this in a minute. Shilaji, what about housing in the base of the pyramid?
Mind, I'll stand. Yeah. This so far makes me want to take a nap. Just a quick aside before I start on housing. I used to know C.K. Prahlad very well. And when he brought out his book, he sent it to me for reviewing. And I said it's like Chinese sweet and sour. And he got really upset in the beginning, but then he acknowledged that the real challenge of creating a term like this is to acknowledge the inequality of the opportunities and the non-opportunities that the concept development of any sort produces. So what are the quick successes that emerged from this concept? All the companies that produced shampoos, toothpastes, washing powder, biscuits, chocolates, all these products now came in small packs. You see them in those colorful aluminium packs in every single panwala, everywhere. And what they did, which was good, was that they produced good quality, unadulterated, whatever consumption goods that poor people also aspired to use, but which they could not afford before. Or when they got it, it was adulterated. So that was a good part. The bad part was that there were no quick wins for the things that poor people needed. So the things that poor people really needed, and now I mean the bottom, so if you on the basis of your percentile development, people out of this concept are beginning to look at the percentile between 95 and 85. But anywhere beyond 85, for their real needs, are things that only poor people's entrepreneurial and inventive behavior brings to them. So the purpose of my coming here is to give a challenge that I hope even 10% of you would pick up, which is to begin to understand that to produce a sellable, marketable, entrepreneurial concept, what's the research, what's the investigation, what's the systematization of existing practices and strategies that poor people do, that educated, professional, inventors, people with imagination, people with resources can transform into the production of ideas, services, and strategies for the poor. And if at the end of this, if the two of us can put together a good argument, then I think it's worth coming at 3 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon. And I really want to thank all of you for being here, because usually when I get invited to a 3-day program and then I'm called into what is called the phantom space after lunch on a Sunday, it means half of the people are either giving excuses that they can't come or they're fast asleep. So I'm really grateful for all of you to be there. So I think what I'd like to do is to quickly walk you through what my experience has been teaching me here in India and internationally. And some of the things that those of you living in this city of Mumbai can begin to look at what people do with new eyes as entrepreneurial, inventive, and strategic behavior for which there is no institutional framework that the poor do, and to see whether you can do something about it. So, shall I just give 1 or 2 examples before I start housing? How many of you have seen rag pickers on the street? Put your hands up. Okay, put your hands down. How many of you think that that is entrepreneurial behavior? Not even half the hands. But what I want you to do is grab the next person that you see collecting scrap and ask them their life story. What you will find is that for 4 generations, I've been doing this work from 1974. I have known 4 generations of migrants who have come into the city. They were landless, assetless, unskilled, wage laborers who, for whatever reason, had to leave the village and come into a city. And the 3 things that any migrant does when they have nothing to do and need to earn money to eat twice a day is to collect waste, to go to a wholesaler and buy thrown away food, fruits, vegetables and sell them in other slums. And third is to do hail party work, which is carrying goods on your head. These are the 3 things that traditionally people have done. Now, if you actually go a little deeper into the scrap process, you'll find that those who collect a particular kind of scrap and can segregate it earn more money per kilo of whatever they produce than those who don't. If you can collect larger quantities, you get more. If you move from being a seller to a buyer, so that's the fourth level. And then if you create an aggregate of sellers who can sell to large factories or industries, that's the fifth level. So there are 5 levels. And at each level, people require more money. Today, all the urban microfinance businesses, one of their largest area of lending is people for purchasing scrap. Now look at the environmental and sustainable implications of this. If you go anywhere in the north, you will find that people are, in every locality, they put plastic and glass and paper, bins, and everybody has to put it in. Here, we also have a tradition where all your mothers and sisters and housewives sell paper, plastic, tin and glass to the scrap person. So we already have a marketable situation. But what we don't have is a city strategy that welcomes, supports, assists and helps them. You'll find that there's a law in the municipality that a scrap collector can't go into a municipal bin and pick up stuff to sell. It's against the law. Did you know that? Did anybody know that? Okay? There is no space. How many of you have seen that little cubby hole in a neighborhood with a weighing scale where people sell paper? Okay. 10 years from now, you won't see it. Because the value of space is so much that that person will earn 100 times more selling or renting that place for something else than doing this. So basically what we are doing is we are taking a good entrepreneurial natural practice that is good for the city and we are killing it and we substitute it by trying to train all of us who are anarchic about putting paper and plastic and all these things in bins, which the garbage collection van will put together and take to the dump. So I just want to give this as an example. Maybe for 2 minutes you can talk about the other issues and then I can go back to housing.
Thank you. You know, I think one of the key learnings or which is very different from working with the regular markets, because all of you are interested in looking at this market and saying, is there an opportunity for me to do something here? You know, the key element which comes up in our work, and I'm sure Sheilaji will agree with me, the work involves a lot of trust, right? So for example, when you go into a community, let's talk about a low-income community of like rag pickers or even the auto rickshaw drivers. All of these people are part of the city. And I famously call them the invisibles of the city, right? Because unfortunately, none of us know where the auto rickshaws walas live. Because we don't literally care where they live. But we want them to come in for service. Our maids, you know, the taxi drivers, our own drivers, we don't know where they live because we don't care, but we want them to come for service. So it's invisibles of the city. Now, the invisibles, unfortunately, are the large number of people who are living in the cities. Now, when you want to deal with these people, they generally do not trust anybody who comes from an outside saying, I want to help you. Or a company going inside and saying, I want to come and help you with this product or a service and buy this product or a service. You need to establish the element of trust, which is much more important than anything else. So, one of the ways which we have seen success is that, let me give you an example not from India, but it'll also give you, it's related to housing. You know, in Colombia, the women wanted to improve the tiles, the house by laying more ceramic tiles. You know, the ceramic tiles are available everywhere. So the question was, Why can't they just go and buy tiles, what's available in the market, and lay it? It's so simple, right? But we realized the problem was deeper. One, there was nobody willing to give them a loan. Why would somebody give a loan to buy a ceramic tile? And secondly, whatever was available in the market was much beyond what they could afford. So we had a social organization who brought this problem. We took it to a large tile manufacturer and said, hey, can you do something about it? And the tile manufacturer was a company called Col Ceramica. They said, yeah, it's a great idea. We'll do something about it. They developed a new brand of tiles only for the low-income community. And more interestingly, they trained 280 women who would actually go in and do the selling of these tiles in the neighborhood. Because if women goes and says, I did this to my house and why don't you pick it up? So they basically went in and started selling tiles. 280 women over a period of 1 year kind of actually sold $12 million worth of tiles. So what you're seeing is that a transformation in the way you look at this opportunity. You have to build the trust. If the company had employed a group of people as marketing executives to go into the slum, forget it. You're not going to make that possible. So here you are actually using the allies. You're using the community networks for being able to do that. So trust is a very, very, very key element to do anything at the base of the pyramid. And the second element, and I'll then pass it on to you, is that generally we all think we know what they want. Right? Meaning it's a very classic thing, right? You go and buy a house today, right? Or you buy anything. What do you get? You get plan A, plan B, or a plan C. And the developer or anybody who has designed the product thinks they know what exactly you want. You fit into one of these three buckets. And you choose the product or a service based on the buckets in front of you. Now, this is a classic example because when you look at any product you buy today, you fall into a bucket because the middle income and probably the higher income, they all know that the general trend of behavior is one of these buckets. Now, when you look at the low income communities, you have to throw away the buckets because they don't fit into your buckets. And first of all, you don't even know what the bucket should look like and how many buckets there should be because you're really looking at a group of people or a community which has got their own geographical needs, they have their cultural needs, they have their financial needs, and you have to create the buckets with them. So you have to unlearn, throw away what you really know, and then go and create something. So design, especially product design, service design, what you're doing, has to be completely rethought in a particular way. So we will just talk a little bit about housing focused on trust and design. And then we'll also talk about the other opportunities beyond housing after this.
Okay. So, do you know what percentage of this city lives in slums? Yeah? 18. 18 or 80? 80. Okay. So here comes what we call the Indian juggle. So you will have one set of statistics saying 58%, somebody else saying 65%. And most of us who work with informal settlements will tell you it's around 80. The reason being, I recently had a chat, because it's come in my consciousness, a chat with somebody in the planning commission who was part of a group that defined what is the number of a household cluster that needs to be in place before you can call it a slum, and that is 50. So if any group of housing is less than 50 as a cluster, they don't get counted in the census. Interesting. Okay. So if you look at these houses, the most interesting element of this is that they were all built without any permission. They were built incrementally. They were built with resources that emerged as people's economic stability in the city grew. And once they couldn't grow horizontally, they started to grow vertically. Is there any fifth observation that any of you can give me about a slum house? So, right. Right. So, as much. Wonderful. He's reached there. So basically you have crowding, you have 2 minutes more for what?
Sorry. You were supposed to end in 2 minutes.
What time did we start? No, I need to know because I don't want to waste my time starting a discussion if I have to stop in a minute, in which case I would prefer to get audience reaction. Who is the organizer here? We started quite late.
Why don't you just
Okay, let me finish this.
Yeah.
It's quite disruptive. So all these households operate outside the framework of the norms and standards that are set for the city. Because they live on land that they don't have the right to live on legally. And they live in this way because the city never planned for them to stay there and always hoped that it could evict them. You can't evict 80% of the city. So one of the things that my organization and the network of communities that we work with do is we have begun amongst communities themselves to study how people build their houses, what's the volume of money per person they can borrow, what are the choices that they make, and what are the technical, design and structural issues that they take up that are good or bad. And what we've realized is how many of you here have done something in civil and structural engineering? I scanned only 3, very sad. I went to many of these colleges to look at whether there were anybody, how many theses or how many projects had been done on slum housing. And I went to about 8 colleges and I found 7. So one of the very important things that is really missing in this whole process is a study of what is actually producing housing for the poor, what materials, designs, what strategies, what legal framework they need to improve the quality of life so that it doesn't take, today it takes 4 to 5 decades for a slum house to develop at least 3 or 4 features of light and ventilation, places where things don't leak, walls don't break. It takes 4 decades to consolidate the house. And so a real challenge in this particular field is looking at design, finance, and legal frameworks that could reduce this 4 decades to 5 years or 10 years at the most. And that's the kind of research that today the industry, which actually should invest in it. Is there somebody from a cement company here or steel company here? Okay, go back and give this idea to them. Because poor people use steel, they use cement, they use tiles, they use frames. These are things that they do, and there's a huge market there. And if there are design elements, delivery elements, strategies that are developed, there's a huge market waiting for you. So I'll stop here and you check about the time.
Okay. Just let me finish this, then they'll throw us out. Just give us like 2 minutes and yeah. I just want to end with two things. One is the key to solving some of these problems at the base of the pyramid, or whatever you want to call it, is scale. Because the problems come in huge sizes. So you will have to think about scale in a way that you have not thought before. So let me give you one last example, non-housing, so then we can close it. India is one of the worst countries in the world for malnutrition. I know how many of you know this. 50% of all children under the age of 5 in this country are malnourished. Now, what is shocking, which many of you might not know, is that the same rate for sub-Saharan Africa is 25%. So we are twice as malnourished as sub-Saharan Africa. And so what it really triggers in your heads is that it may not be linked to poverty alone. So it's not related to poverty. It's about something else other than poverty. Let me give you the third statistics which really bothered people like us. Almost 75% of pregnant women in India are anemic. Across geographies, across urban rural areas. 75%. So, if you combine these three things together, you see the opportunities. Of course, I don't want to go into problems. There's always a huge discussion around problems. Now, what are the opportunities, right? First, how do we measure malnutrition? Height, weight, and circumference of head was measured like this 200 years ago, and we're still continuing to measure our children, whether they are malnourished or not, by using these three parameters. Today, I have not seen, after spending a year and a half in malnutrition, a simple, non-intrusive way to measure the 5 basic parameters of a human body: zinc, vitamin A, vitamin B, iron, and calcium, at the most cost-efficient way. Today, if you want to measure these 5, you need to do a blood test, which will cost you 1,500 rupees. How do you do this for the large number of people? We have no idea. So, opportunity one: how do we measure malnutrition? We don't have a technique. Now, as engineers, obviously your brightest minds, you can come out with something. Number 2, pregnant women and anemia, right? How do you solve pregnant women's anemia? Distribute iron folate tablets. All of you who have seen a pregnant woman in your families are prescribed iron folate tablets. Yeah, what do? You swallow your iron folate tablets. We did a survey with pregnant women. 65% of the pregnant women who are given these iron folate tablets do not eat them every day. They eat once in a week. They're supposed to eat 2 tablets a day. Why? Very simple. It causes flatulence. All of you know what flatulence is. Number 2, it causes constipation, which is very uncomfortable when you're pregnant. And thirdly, rural women today believe that if you eat iron folate tablets, the baby will be dark-skinned. 65% of them believe this. Now, how do you change the mindset? You go into an American drugstore, pick up an iron folate tablet. It causes none of these symptoms. Why? We are using a 3rd generation technology, or 1st generation, whatever you want to call it, to manufacture these tablets. If you eat spinach, you get equal amount of iron. Dates, you get iron. But that is not going to cause you any of these symptoms. So how do you solve it? So how do you manufacture bioavailable drugs in a much faster way? We have no idea still now, right? And the third thing is obviously about supplements, right? All of you at some point of time would have taken a supplement, be it iron, be it multivitamin. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry today. If you're about to fall sick, take a vitamin C shot, right? You have no idea what that vitamin C shot is doing in your body. A classic example, let me give you. Iron fortified cornflakes. You go to a store, you find iron fortified cornflakes, right? All of us love it. How do you eat cornflakes? With milk, right? So what does milk have? Calcium. So if you have calcium and iron together, both of them get flushed out of the system, none of them get absorbed into your body. This is what it's all about, right? So how do you change the mindsets toward you produce something in terms of how do you do it? The last point about opportunities is that today farmers in this country don't know what to grow. Meaning, literally, if it's a genuine farmer, he has no way to understand what grows in his soil. We have literally changed the soil conditions because we are growing cash crops, right? So why can't there be a simple dip test for the farmer? Put something like a pen into the soil and tell you what you can grow. Today, the farmer has to send the soil for testing some few hundred miles away to get the soil tested to understand what to grow. We need solutions. All of this translate to multi-billion-dollar opportunities. I'm not kidding. 10 years ago, nobody could understand what a diabetic measurement was. Today, all of us do it so easily. You have a machine, just put a drop of blood to understand what is your blood sugar levels. Can we not do that the same thing for malnutrition? I end up by just saying the opportunity is so large because all the systems available in the world today only tell you how sick you are. Sickness is not an opposite to wellness. So can we all understand or devise a method to say how well you're feeling? Today I can't. None of us can't in this room saying, how well do you feel today? You literally have no idea because body still remains a black box. Right? Can we all uncover it? Opportunities exist there. So if I just go into every stage of opportunities, malnutrition, we can go so deeper into opportunities. Housing, we have not even started talking about furniture, affordable furniture. Any of you have seen affordable furniture in India? We import furniture from Indonesia and China. We don't have affordable furniture in India. We don't have affordable electronics in India for the home. So how do you get into those things? So every sector, water, electricity, everything we can go into opportunities. All I just want to request you is that please look at opportunities at the size of the problem and turn it around and say, how do I rethink my whole learning and then get into this and think about scale. Thank you very much, and we have to close, otherwise we'll be gone. Thank you.